I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic discussed here on the podcast. Recently, San Antonio Express News education reporter Lauren Caruba has been on location in El Paso, reporting on the recent happenings involving separated families at the border, and has just returned, so now joins me from San Antonio. So Lauren, great to have you on the program here for the first time. And as I just mentioned, you're usually an education reporter. So first off, I'd love to know how you got all wrapped up in what's going on in El Paso. Of course, given recent events, I know the Express News has been reallocating some reporters and resources, usually marked for other areas, in order to document what's been happening there. So, of course, I assume you were wrapped up in that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So you're right. I usually focus on education in San Antonio specifically. And so this was definitely a very different reporting experience for me. Basically, what happened is I came into work on Monday, which would have been June 18th. And I was told that Hearst, the company that owns both us and the Houston Chronicle, was assembling a team of reporters to cover the migrant family separations. And they needed me to go down to the border near Tornillo, where a tent city had been erected the previous Friday to detain migrant children. And the day before I was told I needed to go there, Beto O'Rourke had led this huge rally there at the port of entry where the tents had been set up. And it was clear that the situation was developing into a huge national story. Luckily, school had just gotten out, so it wasn't a huge concern for me to take a bit of a break from my normal beat for a while. So I ended up booking a flight to El Paso at noon that day and was there by 3:30 in the afternoon. I was initially only supposed to be there for a few days, but the story kept developing and gaining steam to the point where I ended up staying there a whole week.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of people will understand why you would have stayed so long. This has really become quite an ongoing story that, the Express News and other media outlets, of course, appropriately so, are going to be covering for quite a long time. So before we get into the types of stories specifically that you had been reporting on and what you experienced there in that area on assignment, let's start with the basics for anyone who might be missing some core information. So regarding President Trump and, immigration specifically, of course, how would you describe the action and the events that led you to being assigned to this El Paso area? And as you just mentioned, booking the flight the same day and getting down there.
So it's a really complicated situation. Earlier in the spring, the Trump administration had announced a quote unquote zero tolerance policy for illegal border separations, meaning that the Department of Justice planned to criminally prosecute every single illegal border crossing, even though doing so only amounted to a misdemeanor. That policy had actually been piloted in El Paso before that, where I was reporting from. So about a year prior to it being formalized, El Paso had kind of been the training ground for this policy, according to immigration attorneys who I spoke with. And so in the spring, it was formalized and implemented across the board. And around the same time that was happening, people who were trying to seek asylum here legally at the ports of entry were being turned away and told there wasn't room for them here. Earlier in June, my colleague Sylvia Foster-Frau, who's our new immigration reporter, did a story reporting on families who were camping out for days on the McAllen Hidalgo International Bridge, waiting for their turn after U.S. Customs and Border Patrol told them there was a backlog in processing asylum seekers. And so there was kind of those two concurrent situations going on. And as a result of that, it appears that families were trying to cross the border at other points instead of at the ports of entry where you can turn yourself in and legally seek asylum. And that was leading to all of these criminal prosecutions for illegal border crossings. And as a result of that, once the parents were in the system for the illegal border crossings, their children could not go with them because in that situation, migrant children become the responsibility of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They are responsible for the welfare of those children, and those children are reclassified as unaccompanied minors. And so they kind of go into a different kind of custody, and they're sent to these shelters across the country in the meantime. And so that's basically where the family separation issue was stemming from, was the implementation of the zero tolerance policy led to these separations of families at the border. And it should be noted that, the families who were ended up crossing the border legally, they were often fleeing horrific circumstances and violence in Central America, mostly families from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. And they were basically coming here and trying to seek asylum as a last resort.
And so let's talk about these locations that you were reporting from, some of those experiences that you had in the area, obviously revolving around everything that you just mentioned. Tell me about what you were up to.
So when I was at the border, I was kind of splitting my time between two main locations. So I was reporting from El Paso, where many of the immigrant parents were being detained or processed by immigration authorities, and also in Tornillo, which is about 40 miles away from El Paso. It's a kind of rural farming area, and that's where one of the port of entries is, and where that tent city, which is basically an emergency shelter that was set up for migrant children, that's where that was. And so I was kind of splitting my time in between those two locations. And there was a lot of stuff going on in both of those locations. There were multiple rallies and protests. There was vigils, congressional visits, press conferences. The issue seemed to have struck a really deep chord with a lot of people. And so there were a lot of events happening in both of those areas that were newsworthy. And I was kind of basically trying to go back and forth as much as possible and attend as many things as I could, because I wanted to learn as much as I could while I was there and cultivate relationships with the people who were there on the ground.
And so those two locations obviously connected to each other, but still very different geographically and the purpose of both of those areas. What kind of access did you have? Obviously, you're a member of the press, you're credentialed, but there are a lot of people there because of the specific reasons that those locations exist, participating in what's going on there. There are other members of the press, there are protesters. I mean, what kind of access did you have?
It tended to vary depending on what you were trying to do. So, for example, getting access to the families who were in detention, so the parents who were in detention, like at the El Paso Processing Center, for example, is very difficult. You have to go through this lengthy process where you get permission from the person's attorney, and you have to get permission from the people who run the facility, and then you kind of have to negotiate the terms, and you have to give 48 hours notice. And there's a whole process for trying to get in and talk to the people who are currently being detained. So I wasn't actually able to make that happen when I was there. There was also other ways to talk to parents who had been separated from their kids. For example, Annunciation House, a hospitality house in El Paso that takes in migrants and refugees often after they are released from detention, had access to a lot of families, and they were kind of coming in through their doors and trying to help them get back on their feet and get in touch with lawyers, and also get in touch with family and friends in other areas of the United States where they could go stay. And so I ended up talking to some families through Annunciation House. I ended up, attending some vigils where there was families who had been affected by the current immigration crackdown, as well as being separated from their kids as a result of other immigration detention policies. And, in terms of access to the Tornillo shelter specifically, that was absolutely not happening for most of the time that I was there. There were several congressional visits there. Beto O'Rourke and Joaquin Castro both made a visit to the facility on the Saturday that I was there, which was almost a week after O'Rourke had led the rally there on Father's Day. And so we were able to do kind of a briefing with the members of Congress who had gone inside, but we were not allowed access ourselves until the following Monday, which was actually the day that I was leaving and returning to San Antonio. And so I had to kind of coordinate that with the media people, with Health and Human Services, in order to gain access. So it was pretty difficult in some situations. In other situations, you just really needed to show up, and there were people there who would talk to you. But it was kind of an ongoing thing where access was always kind of a question.
And so that being the case, the access that you had, the types of people you just mentioned that you were able to speak to, how did you package that? What kind of stories, what kind of reporting were you doing during your time in the El Paso area?
Well, it was a really fluid situation, and things kept happening, changing by the day and even by the hour when I was there. For example, 2 days after I got there, President Trump signed the executive order that ended the family separations, but it raised a lot more questions than it answered, and didn't really address what would happen to the families who had already been separated. And it also indicated a desire to instead house migrant families together en masse on military bases. So basically, when I was reporting, I had to be cognizant of the fact that the situation was rapidly changing and try to keep a pulse on that while also, being out in the field, which for people who don't understand what that's like, you're kind of sent to a place that you might have never been before. You're talking to people you've never talked to before. And so you're just kind of constantly working. And so I was trying to keep track of that when I was talking to the people on the ground. I think I ended up filing about 8 stories when I was there. And so what those included, several rallies and congressional visits at the Tornillo shelter. They included stories that talked to parents and guardians who had been separated from their kids, who described the anguish that they experienced as a result. I covered the release of 32 parents who eventually had their criminal cases for illegal entry dropped and were released to Annunciation House, the hospitality home. And on my last day, I was able to go on a tour of the Tornillo shelter with other journalists. At the time, that shelter was housing 326 kids in their teens, including 23 who had been separated from their parents. And so as I did all of those stories, I was talking to immigration attorneys who had direct access to families and knew their cases really well. I was talking to the director and volunteers at Annunciation House who worked with these families and were trying to help them. I talked to Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services, a local nonprofit that got the government contract to give the kids in the Tornillo camp legal services. I talked to people at rallies. I talked to various politicians and members of Congress who were on the ground and were trying to get information about what was happening. And eventually, I ended up talking to officials at the Tornillo shelter itself when we went on the tour there. So there was a lot of different things that were going on, and we were trying to, focus on the developments in the story, but also make sure that we were telling the stories of the people who were directly affected by this policy.
And of course, speaking of people who are directly affected, you're going to think about the people who are doing the crossing, and specifically, really the face of this whole thing has been the children. So tell me about that trip to the shelter. Tell me more about that.
Well, so it's important to note that not all of the kids at the shelter were kids who had been separated from their families. That shelter was set up as a result of the zero tolerance policy, though, because basically what ended up happening is, we have 2,500 kids who are suddenly separated from their parents, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement has to put them somewhere. And so that Tornillo shelter was basically an emergency shelter set up in the middle of the desert, essentially at that port of entry there, to house the other kids who were in their custody, who are quote unquote unaccompanied minors who might have crossed the border by themselves. And so that shelter included mostly kids who had crossed the border on their own, and also about 23 kids who had been separated from the parents. It was actually initially 26 kids, but 3 of those kids were eventually reunified with their parents. And so touring that shelter, it's in Tornillo, which is a very, very rural town, 40 miles outside of El Paso. There's farming, I think pecan farming in that area, but there's not much out there. The facility is actually not visible from when you're entering the port of entry. It's behind these like barbed wire gates. And when you go inside, it's kind of like a camp, basically. It's rows of white and tan tents that are set up. The camp was being run by BCFS Health and Human Services, which is a San Antonio-based company that responds to natural disasters and disasters of other kinds across the country. And so when we were there, we did see the children, who were the vast majority of whom were boys. There was only 14 girls when we went there. But, we were obviously being escorted by a Health and Human Services spokesperson and the man who was running the facility as part of BCFS's contract there. And so, it was obviously, not the same thing as if we had just been given unfettered access and were allowed to go talk to the kids. We were on a tour and we were not allowed to interview the kids. We were allowed to say hi and ask how they were doing. We saw them playing soccer. We saw the tents that they lived in, which were pretty military style. It was like a row of tents and they were all labeled Alpha 1, Alpha 2. There was a row of bunk beds inside in which they slept, not many personal items around, just because the kids don't have that many things. And we saw where they ate, where they slept. They shower and use the bathroom on tractor trailers. What was really interesting about the tour, though, and pretty revealing, was that the emergency manager who kind of runs the whole place basically said that he and his staff really didn't want to be doing this mission. They thought that the family separation policy was unnecessary and that all it did was hurt kids. He called it an incredibly dumb, stupid decision by our leadership, was the quote that he gave. And he basically said that they were just doing the best that they could to take care of the kids, considering the circumstances, but that he didn't believe that the zero tolerance policy would stop people from coming here, because these people who are here to seek asylum are fleeing unimaginable circumstances, situations where maybe some of their family members have been killed, where they've been threatened with violence, have experienced violence, are basically trying to save their lives. And so, it was really illuminating to hear him talking about the policy in that way when he was responsible for the care of these kids.
We only have a few moments left, Lauren, but I really want to get your thoughts on, I guess, the next chapter of this. Obviously, as I've mentioned, you're back in San Antonio as you speak to me right now. But as someone who spent some time in this area, got to meet some of the kids, even in the limited capacity that you mentioned, spent so much time there asking questions and filing the reports that you talked about. What do you think is important to either focus on going forward, or maybe some things that we don't know? And when I say we, reported in the media, either with the Express News or anywhere else, what are these missing pieces to the puzzle, or the parts of the puzzle that we might already know that are so important moving forward that we should pay attention to?
I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions about what's going on here. It's still unclear how and when some of these parents who have been separated from their kids are going to be reunited with their kids. We've seen a couple of those reunifications already, but it's a very small number. For example, I went to a press conference where several parents from Annunciation House who had been released, who had had their charges dropped, who were among 32 parents who had had their charges dropped when I was there and were released from custody. They were telling their stories at a press conference to a room full of reporters. And it was very unclear how and when they might be reunited with their kids. The Health and Human Services says that they know where every parent is and every kid is. But in reality, when those parents were released, all they were given was a hotline number to call to try to locate their children. And if you call that hotline, advocates tell us that, you're put on hold for an hour, hour and a half, and then you're told to call back. And so there's no immediate answer there. So I think that piece of how and when they're going to be reunified is still a big question mark. I think you're probably also going to keep seeing people being released. And so eventually, hopefully, the next step will be covering the reunifications and how the reunifications happen. But then there's also the question of the executive order, which seemed to indicate that, the mass detention of migrant families might be the alternative that the government is looking for in order to keep families together. And so, that raises a whole bunch of other questions because, housing families together, even if they're together, advocates say that can still be traumatizing to both the parents and the children. And so there are questions about whether that is a good solution to try to avoid separating families at the border. I don't cover immigration full time. I'm probably not going to be covering this story moving forward, but the situation was not resolved when I left El Paso. There is still so much to be covered and to look at in this situation. There's still so many questions. We still have 2,000 kids who are kind of in shelters across the country, and how they'll be reunified is kind of the big question right now. And then moving forward, there's other questions about how federal immigration policy is going to be shaped by the uproar that surrounded this situation.
San Antonio Express News education reporter Lauren Caruba, who also, travels to other areas on the drop of a dime when she's needed. Thank you so much for your thoughts today, and best of luck continuing on with your normal duties in San Antonio.
Thank you for having me.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News education reporter Lauren Caruba for joining me for today's episode of In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.